everyone, welcome. I'm Carla Murdoch. I'm director of the Mudd Center for Ethics, and I appreciate that you've joined us today for Seema Gajwani's lecture in the Mudd Center's series, which is about beneficence, practicing an ethics of care. And before I launch into the introduction, I am instructed to read this notice about being in the University Chapel. So before we begin, please locate the nearest exit in case of emergency. In addition to the door that you entered through, there are 3 exits in the basement at the bottom of the stairwell located behind me to my right. So my duty has been carried out with regard to that. So let's talk about beneficence and care. The aim of this series this year is to explore our responsibilities to promote and safeguard the well-being of others, as well as how we can do that well. Among other topics this year, we've discussed the importance of helping others on their terms in a manner that honors their dignity and goals. We've discussed the potential of compassion-based meditation and of friendships to foster our ability to recognize others' needs and care for them well. We've explored how norms of competitive individualism may work against how we attend to the common good. And today, Ms. Gajwani will address the promise of restorative justice for cooperation and healing among those coping with the effects of crime. As we settle into this space together, let's pause in appreciation for the original and current caretakers of the land that surrounds us. WNL exists on the ancestral homeland of the Monacan Indians, who have lived here for over 10,000 years and continue to live here today. WNL's Native American and Indigenous cohort and the Native American Student Organization provide us with opportunities to learn more about Monacan culture and community. So I hope you will be inspired to take advantage of their programming, and the Mudd Center will help keep you posted about that. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Seema Gajwani. She is Special Counsel for Juvenile Justice Reform and the Chief of the Restorative Justice Section in the Office of the Attorney General for the District of Columbia. Her work focuses on restorative justice practices in which those affected by a crime, victim, offender, and other community members are brought together to participate in a process of reconciliation. Restorative justice focuses on repairing harm and rebuilding relationships in the community. Ms. Gajwani was educated at Northwestern University and at the NYU School of Law. Her career has addressed criminal justice from multiple vantage points. During law school, she interned at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the Juvenile Justice Project of Louisiana, among other positions. She began her career as a trial attorney in the DC Public Defender Service and then ran the Criminal Justice Program at the Public Welfare Foundation in Washington, DC. In her current position, she has launched the first restorative justice program housed within a prosecutor's office. In 2019, Ms. Gajwani was selected to be an Obama Foundation Fellow in recognition of her important work. Her lecture today is titled Restorative versus Adversarial Justice, a New Paradigm for Addressing Crime and Conflict. So please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Can you all hear me? No. Hello? No. It says it's on. Hello? 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 I'm happy to use this as well. No. Okay, no. No. I'm not supposed to use that. How about this? Very close to my mouth? Good, okay. Not good? No, not good. Okay, I'll hold this. How about that? Is that okay? Can you hear me now? Oh no, I'm so sorry. I've screwed something up here. Fix it. Oh, I can use a handheld mic? I think he wants me to use a handheld mic. Is that right? Oh, no, it's down here. I'm fine with that. Sorry for the technical difficulties. You thought you had passed that after the pandemic, but no. Still, we have technical difficulties. Well, thank you so much, Carla. Thank you for inviting me. I feel so welcome, and I'm really honored to be here and to speak with all of you. I understand that I'm here to talk about beneficence in public policy. When Carla called me over Zoom and generously invited me to come and speak before all of you and talk to me a little bit about this lecture series, I, quietly opened up another window and I Googled beneficence. Definition? And it turns out I also don't know how to spell beneficence, so this is all details. But what Google told me was that beneficence is defined as an act of charity, mercy, kindness, with a strong connotation of doing good to others, including moral obligation. And I've been recently watching a TED Talk by a neuroscientist on restorative justice, and he talked about the fact that acquiring moral behavior is simply part of growing a normal brain, but that our brains are really sensitive to environmental stress. And that in and of itself can inhibit the normal growth of morality. But what he says is that the brain is capable of extraordinary change well into adulthood. So you can build new neural pathways called neurogenesis, which I also don't know how to spell. And one way to build the foundational neural pathways of morality is through empathy. And in my mind, empathy is what restorative justice is all about. And I'm here to talk about restorative justice. Restorative justice is about empathy, but it's also about healing and connection and trust. And restorative justice can also be about radical transformation. It can be about confrontation of systems of oppression. It's about strengthening the moral brain, and it's about changing the world. But let me start with talking a little bit about how I learned about restorative justice several years ago. I was working at the DC office of the Attorney General, where I work now, and as part of my work, one day I found myself in Ballou Senior High School, which is this large urban high school in southeast Washington, DC. And I was there and came across this woman named Ivy Hilton, who was a restorative justice facilitator, and she invited me to sit in on a restorative justice meeting, a dialogue. There had been a fight between two high school students in a classroom, and actually it really wasn't a fight at all. One of the students just beat the lights out of the other kid in a classroom, punching him repeatedly in the face until a teacher pulled him off. It was a Monday that I was there, and this fight had happened on the Friday before, so just a few days before. But when the smaller kid came into the room that I was in with Ivy Hilton, you could still see the swelling on his face and like the blood red in the white part of his eye. He walked in with his mother and his aunt, and I'll call him Darren for privacy purposes. So Darren walks in, his mom and his aunt are really upset. They're talking about how bad his face looked on Friday, how badly he was hurt, and he was pretty quiet. And then the other boy walks into the room, his name, I'll call him Malik for this purpose, and he comes in with his mother and his mother's fiance. And then Ivy, the facilitator, asked us to all sit in these chairs that had been assembled into a circle with no table in the middle. And she turned to all of us. She asked us for our names. We did introductions, some ground rules, and then she looked at Malik. And she said, "Tell us what happened from the beginning." Now, Malik is this big kid. He is like tall, he's like thicker, he's way bigger than Darren. And this made sense to me, right? Bigger, stronger kid pummels weaker, smaller kid. End of story. But then Malik started to talk, and he spoke really quietly, like he was whispering, and he was like hunched over in his chair, awkward, embarrassed. He was so quiet that you had to lean over just to hear from him, and he said something like, "They were saying my name, but it wasn't my name," him and all these boys. And it turns out that Darren and his friends had been making fun of Malik's name. They'd been taunting him, and it had been going on for weeks, and I guess this was like the last straw. And so Ivy turned to Darren, and she said, "Darren, tell us what happened from the beginning." And Darren's like, "Nothing. I just called his name, and then he got up, and he came over to me, and he hit me out of nowhere for no reason." And Ivy asked the group, she said, "Well, what I'd like to do is for us to go around the circle and say what you heard from Darren. Tell us what it made you think of, and tell us anything that it made you think of from your life." And so the first person was like, "I'm not sure that Darren's telling the full story here." And another person said, "When I was a young person, I myself was kind of bullied about something, and it was really hurtful." And then it gets to Darren's mom, and she says, "Darren thinks he's funny. Darren is a joker, and he loves to joke around, but what he doesn't realize is that he can hurt people, and he can get hurt himself." And so this circle of people just continues to have a conversation. We talk for about an hour and a half altogether. Both mothers talked about the fact that they have other children to raise, and they don't believe in violence, and they didn't raise their kids this way. Malik's mother talked about how she works 2 jobs, and she had to take off work on Friday and then again today for this meeting, and she was going to get in trouble with her boss. Darren's mother looked to her son and told him, "You know, people look at black boys in Southeast DC and they assume that they're violent kids. And I know you're not a violent kid. I just don't want you to end up dead." And then she starts crying. "I don't want you to be a number." And the circle went on, and both sets of parents apologized to the other parents for what their son had done. Malik's mother said to Darren's mother, "If I see you on the street, you know that you have a friend." She said, "You know, I heard a lot of rumors about what happened on the street over the weekend. I heard that your son called my son a bee. I heard that you were going to bring your people up to this meeting today." She said, "I woke up this morning and I said, 'Lord, help me. I'm going down to Baloo to brawl.'" She was ready to fight. And she said, "That's why I brought my fiancé with me." But now, she said, "I see that we've actually made friends. I don't think this should have happened, but I want to thank these boys for bringing our families together." Now, both boys were super uncomfortable during this whole time. It was really hard for Malik to admit what he had done in front of his mother and these other people. And Darren was forced to admit the role that he and his friends had played in taunting Malik. And it also seemed that the boys didn't often hear their moms talk about their hopes and their dreams for them. And when the moms cried, you could see like the pain on these kids' faces. Importantly, these boys were watching their parents. They were watching these adults solve problems, show remorse and empathy, and model connection. The adults around the circle, the community itself, not Ivy and not me, talked to Malik about how violence was not the appropriate response here, but they did so with empathy and compassion. Malik's mother's fiancé explained to the boys that he sometimes went to this boxing gym and that he would maybe bring the 2 of them there together so that they could like channel their aggression in a positive way. And we learned later that he did. He took both boys to this boxing gym. And Darren's aunt at some point said to Darren, "Well, what are you going to do, Darren, when your friends want to bug Malik again? What are you going to do?" And he's like, "Nah, don't worry about it. It's not going to happen, not going to happen." And she was like, She was like, Say I'm your friend. Hey, Darren, what are we gonna do? Why don't we go do this thing? And he gets into character and he's like, no, it's not like that. He's cool. It's taken care of. Don't bother him. And they went back and forth and back and forth. They practiced. And towards the end of the conference, each boy apologized. Ivy, the facilitator, made them do it twice, the second time with eye contact. The group came to an agreement about what Malik and Darren had to do. Each promise was written down and signed. They came to agreements about how they would behave when they saw each other again, how they would talk about this incident on social media, how they would talk about each other with their friends going forward. And then that was it. The moms hugged. The kids stood up and did that like shoulder bump thing that they do, and everybody left. It was done. And I was floored. Darren was hurt with injuries. And in DC, Malik would have been charged with assault. As Carla mentioned, I'd been a public defender for 6 years as my first job, and so I knew exactly what would have happened to Malik had he gone through the court system, because many of my clients had done the same thing. After the fight at school, Court Malik would have been arrested, handcuffed in front of his friends, in front of administrators at the school. He would have been taken for processing to the police station. He'd spend probably 1 night or 2 nights locked up, pending court, and then he would go to court and have to sit in a cell block behind the courtroom for hours until his case was called. And for a few minutes during that time, he would be visited by a court-appointed lawyer, somebody like me, or Professor King, who is one of your professors and started with me at the Public Defender Service. And what we, as public defenders, would have told him during those few minutes is we would have said, we can beat this. The government's evidence isn't that strong. So don't admit to anything. Don't tell anybody what you did, and let me do all the talking. That's our job. That's what we were supposed to do. And to court Malik, his lawyer is the one person who knows the worst of what he's done, and that's what we tell him to do. And as defense attorneys, what we're doing is we're investing into a bank account that will hopefully pay back later when we have to have conversations about taking pleas and trials. We're trying to build trust quickly with our clients and their families to show them that we're on their side, that we will fight for them. But what we're also doing inadvertently is we're undermining what the research shows is fundamental to a person changing their behavior, and that is accepting responsibility for it. So eventually, Court Malik's case would be called, and he would go into a courtroom with a judge, a prosecutor, a probation officer, a defense attorney, and all of these people would discuss his fate. And none of these people know Malik, and they don't know his family. And to them, Court Malik will be the same thing that they read on the police report and I saw when I first met him. A large teenage boy who violently assaulted a smaller boy in a classroom. It's an assault, it's violent, it's a poor black kid. Everybody has seen this story again and again. And the prosecutor and the judge will never treat Malik as the kid who is painfully shy and struggles in school and lost his father when he was 8 years old and takes really good care of his little sister. To the prosecutor, Court Malik will remind him about Darren, the victim. And as a prosecutor, it's his job to do justice for the victim and the victim's mother and the community. And so he will prosecute fully. And back in the courtroom, a probation officer will stand up and say every worst thing about Court Malik as he stands there restrained, in a jumpsuit, silenced. The probation officer will talk about mediocre school grades, maybe he skipped some classes, he's probably hanging out with the wrong crowd. And for Court Malik, at his age, who he is and what he thinks of himself is inordinately influenced by what others think of him. He looks tough and hardened, but his self-esteem is fragile.
His psychological development is vulnerable. And in a courtroom, silenced and ashamed, Court Malik will hear what is thought of him by all of those adults who don't know him. And then he will deliver. We contribute to stigmatizing kids, and then they believe what we have told them, that they are bad, that they are broken, and that they are unforgivable. And then we blame them for it. Eventually, Court Malik will enter a guilty plea. The prosecutor will never know that Malik felt terribly about what he did right after it happened, that he would have accepted responsibility on the first day of court if he had been given that option. And at no point will Malik ever have to apologize to Darren for what he did. And at no point will Darren have to apologize for his role, however small. And when the judge asks him if he committed the crime, Malik's lawyer will lean over to her client and whisper in his ear that now is the time that he's supposed to say yes in order to enter into the guilty plea. To Malik, none of this will feel like accountability. And to the victim, it won't feel like justice either. Court Malik, in fact, will return to school, and now the underlying problem between him and Darren will not have been addressed. In fact, now Darren and his friends may be emboldened, or maybe they'd be preparing for retribution or retaliation. Malik will be the kid who has been locked up, the kid with a probation officer who's a criminal. So it turns out that the very nature of prosecuting him produces a Court Malik who is more wounded, angrier, and more likely, actually, to harm again. Malik will have taken a step towards the pernicious reality that in Washington, D.C., if you're born a black boy in a certain neighborhood, it's more likely that you will go to jail than you will go to college. And he'll be just another statistic. And we've seen it happen again and again. But none of that actually did happen. What happened was that two boys and their families resolved the issue with accountability and fairness in an hour-and-a-half conversation. So you can see why I was floored by this. Now, my office, the Office of the Attorney General for the District of Columbia, it's the exclusive prosecutor for all juvenile crime for Washington, D.C. And in 2017, we launched a Restorative Justice Program. And since then, a set of full-time trained restorative justice facilitators and I have brought together victims of crime and young people and their families and supporters for over 200 restorative justice conferences or circles. We have successfully used restorative justice in stabbing cases, carjackings, burglaries, instead of traditional court processing. For a while, our cases were for the most part lower level, simple assaults, low-level robberies. But today, we focus exclusively on serious violent crime. And the reason that we take serious violent crime when the victim is amenable is because we know that handling those cases with restorative justice is the best shot we have at changing the behavior of the youth who committed those crimes, and the best shot of reducing recidivism. And the research bears this out. The most rigorous study on restorative justice to date came out of the UK and Australia, and it's a randomized controlled trial across 12 sites across those two countries. It took almost 10 years, and it covered over 2,000 cases, and all 12 sites used restorative justice as an alternative to traditional court processing. Some of the sites used restorative justice for serious violent crime and low-level crime, and some picked one. And some sites used it for juveniles, some sites used it for adults, some sites used it for both. And what they found was that across all of the sites, there were statistically significant reductions in recidivism for the people who went through restorative justice compared to the people who just went through traditional court processing. And that's not unusual. We've seen in a lot of research that recidivism goes down when you use restorative justice, although most of the research isn't as rigorous as these site studies. But two fascinating conclusions that this research came to were, one, that the recidivism reduction was actually greater when used for serious violent crime than for low-level crime. And the recidivism reduction using restorative justice was greater for adults than it was for juveniles. And as an aside, another interesting fact was that in all of these 12 sites, the people who were facilitating these restorative justice conversations were police officers. Another important question is why victims of crime would agree to do restorative justice. What do they get out of it? And there is research on surveys of tens of thousands of victims out of the Department of Justice that shows what victims say that they want after being the victims of crime. And by and large, across all of these surveys, what they find is generally victims are looking for 5 things. They want answers to their questions. They want their voices to be heard. They want a sense of control relative to the event. They want the offender to repair the harm as best as he or she possibly can. And more than anything, they want this to never happen to them or anybody else again. Which is a lot to ask for a justice system whose recidivism rate is 70% and higher. What victims say that they want in these surveys actually corresponds very closely to what the research on trauma says that victims of crime need to heal from trauma. And some victims choose to participate in restorative justice because they are generous and charitable. They don't want to ruin somebody's life. They don't need the person to go to jail. Some victims, however, they choose to do restorative justice even though they're really angry, even though they're very mad, because they need something that the court process can't give them. They have to walk around in the world every day after this happened to them, and they're worried maybe about seeing the person again, or they may be worried about retaliation after prosecution. Many of our victims want to tell this person and their family members how badly they were hurt and how this has changed their lives. And almost all of them want to gauge for themselves if the person truly is sorry, if they're remorseful. Some victims also want to know if they were targeted and if there's anything that they can do differently in the future so that they are not the victims of crime again. But none of this can they get from the justice system. Virtually none of this do they get. And what I've seen in my office is that when we allow a prosecutor to sit in on a restorative justice conference, they understand the value of restorative justice. After a prosecutor sits in on a restorative justice circle, we can track that that prosecutor will refer more cases and more serious cases to us afterwards. And sometimes we invite an observer to sit in, a judge or a probation officer, an outside observer, and we often hear from them that they can't believe that after the trauma of crime, that people can come together and see each other as human beings, and they can come to resolution. And it is a question, how is it that we're able to bring people together after so much damage, after a lot of reason to mistrust and to fear and to be angry? How can we bring them together? And how can they come to a point where they feel better? How can we bring them to a point where they resolve the matter? Because in restorative justice, what we do is we put the victim and the offender and their supporters together in this circle. And before we start talking about the crime, what we do is we start to talk about the people. We talk about experiences that they share. And you can't do that in a courtroom. But what it does is it allows the accused to trust that the victim won't come after them. And it allows the victim to trust the world a little bit again. The first time I sat in on a restorative justice circle, not a dialogue, not a conference, was at that same school in Southeast DC in Washington, Ballou Senior High School. And it was before I had sat in on that conference with Malik and Darren. It was at a time where I was trying to bring prosecutors from our office to spend time closer to the communities that are being involved in the justice system. So that day I had brought these 2 prosecutors from my office, and the 3 of us showed up at this large high school in the middle of the summer. And we are, prosecutors, everybody's dressed up in heels and the suits and all, and it was very awkward because we showed up in the middle of summer and there were no students there that day, so everybody was in jeans and cutoffs. But it was also awkward because the school was in a lot of turmoil. They had this new principal, and it was her second year, and she decided to fire half the staff administrators and teachers, and it had just happened. And everybody who's remaining at the school was told to show up in this big room and sit in a circle because she wanted to bring restorative justice to the school. It was a flawed plan. Anyway, so we walk in and we're all dressed up and we don't know any of these people and they don't know us, and the principal was like, just go in there and sit in this circle. And so we show up and they kind of make room for us, but everybody is like really anxious, right? There's a lot of suspicion and mistrust. People are super shook up in this room. And there's this outside facilitator who's there, and she has everyone go around the circle and does like some icebreaker question, like what's your favorite food or something, just to get the hang of going around the circle. And there are a bunch of people. There's almost like 40 people in this circle. It's huge. And then she says, okay, I'm going to ask a question, and we're going to have this talking piece, and we're going to send it around, and you're going to all answer this question. And the question was, what is a challenge you've been through in your life that you've gotten through, and it's made you stronger? So we're like, all right. So she hands the talking piece to the person next to her, and that person answers with kind of like a superficial, kind of dry answer, and just hands it over. And the next lady, she's like, I pass, because the lady told us you could pass. So I was like, this is not going to work. And then it goes to the third person, or maybe the fourth person, and it was this guy, and he tells a story about the fact that he grew up in a very religious household in the Midwest, and he's gay, and he came out to his family shortly after high school, and they totally rejected him, and they kicked him out of the house, and they haven't spoken to him since, and he had to kind of find his way, and he made it to Washington, D.C. And as he's speaking, he's getting all choked up, and I'm getting all choked up. And then he passes the talking piece. And a couple of people later, somebody talks about the fact that her husband, who she lived with in the area because they were from Washington, D.C., from Southeast, was shot and killed many years ago. And she's worked at this school for all these years, and she has to pass by the place where he was shot every day on the way to school. And she talked to us about how when it first happened, she thought that it was just going to destroy her, but that now she's okay. And so now, there's a lady going through her purse and getting tissues out and sending them around the circle, and people are, starting to tear up. And then it goes, and there's another lady who's I know her, she's like this tough as nails administrator. She suffers no fools, it's kind of mean. And she starts talking, and tells this story about being a single mother. She's got this little daughter, and for 5 years, she never went on a vacation. And she decided she was going to go on this vacation, so she drives her daughter up to Pittsburgh to be with her mom, to drop her off with the girl's grandma, to go on a girls' trip with some of her friends. She drops her off, she goes on this trip, and then she gets a phone call that her mom had a massive stroke. And the daughter was taken away by Child Protective Services. And so she has to drive back, and she's trying to take care of her mom, and she has to go before a judge and beg to get her daughter back. And she talked about how it was the scariest moment in her life and the most humiliating. And by this time, she's struggling through the story, and people are reaching out to touch her, and they're sending her tissues, and people are openly weeping. And so this talking piece goes around the circle. It gets a long way. We, I think, all spoke, and then at some point, we realized we had to get back to the office. So I was like, I'm sorry, excuse me, we have to leave. And the facilitator was like, oh, it's fine, we'll just take a break. So everybody stretch your feet, go to the bathroom, we'll take a break, and we'll start up again after. And so we get up, and we're gathering our stuff to leave, me and these other two prosecutors, and a few of the people come over to us, and they give us hugs. These are total strangers. And they came over, and they gave us hugs. And it was they didn't know who we were. They didn't know why we were there. But something about the practice of sharing something personal about yourself and hearing something personal about somebody else, it makes you feel closer to that person. And so what we do in our restorative justice conferences or the meetings that we hold is we first prepare all the sides extensively, individually, but then when we actually have the meeting itself, we start with a couple of questions to allow people to be vulnerable. Questions like, what's a challenge that you've been through that makes you stronger? Or what is something that people assume about you that's not true? Or, some sort of question like that. Because when we share something personal with someone, and importantly, when they share something personal about themselves back to you, you begin to trust each other. You bond in this way. Sharing requires you to make yourself vulnerable, and it's like you open up your heart and you like lay it out there, and you hope that the other side will receive it, and then they open up something and they hand it to you, and it's like one soul saying to another, I see you as a human being, and you can put some trust in that, and you see me, and so you can put some trust in that too, which is not to say that I'm not hurt and angry and scared, and it's not to say that I'll necessarily forgive you and forgive what you've done, but it is to say that you may have done something that's really, really bad, but you are a person first, and I see you as a human being, and so I trust you on that level. And then it's easier after having those kind of conversations to talk about the hard things about crime. Trust, humanity, and dignity, these are the cornerstones of restorative justice. And yet, distrust is like a feature of our court system. In fact, the adversarial system, it feeds on mistrust. It was built that way. We had a case with 5 boys, 5 co-respondents is what we call them. And this is kind of a brutal case where these 5 kids jumped a man on the metro platform, which is our subway system. And in the fight, the man was thrown off into the tracks of the train, and he badly damaged his leg, and he was in great danger. And the prosecutor offers pleas to these 5 respondents that are, not the most serious charge, but kind of the next charge. So not aggravated assault, but felony assault. And she includes restorative justice in the plea offer because we've talked to the victim who says he is open to doing restorative justice. And so because of that, 4 of the kids agreed to take this plea and do restorative justice, and our restorative justice facilitator went and spoke to each of those 4 kids, and they're all deeply remorseful, they want to apologize, they're ready to do this. But one of the defense attorneys refused the deal. She reasoned that if she went to trial, she would lose on felony assault, which is what the plea offer was, and so therefore she shouldn't have to take the plea. Her client should not have to do restorative justice. And she demanded a simple assault plea, which is pretty unreasonable given the charge. But our prosecutor was like, no way, she didn't relent. So because of that, one of the 5 kids went to trial, and the other 4 boys and the victim didn't do restorative justice, but waited until after the trial in order to do the restorative justice meeting. And so they went to trial, the victim went on the stand, testified, the government put on its case in chief, and after the government was done, the judge called for a recess, said we're gonna take a break, and everybody kind of takes a break, and at the time, the boy, the kid who was going to trial, he goes to the bathroom in the courthouse, which is on the same floor as the courtroom. And when he goes to the bathroom, the victim is in there washing his hands, and he sees the victim, and the victim sees him, and he says, I'm really sorry for what I did. And the victim's like, yeah, it's fine, whatever, okay. And so then he walks out. And then he goes into the courtroom, and he's sitting there waiting for the court trial to start again, and he's sitting by the prosecutor, and he looks at the prosecutor, and he's like, you know what? That kid isn't that bad. I mean, he just apologized to me in the bathroom. And the prosecutor's like, he did what? Because she's eyeing a victory. She's like, he said sorry to you? And he's like, yeah, he said sorry to me. And she's like, awesome. She goes to the judge and says, I want to reopen my case. She puts the victim back on the stand. She has him testify about what happened. It's a statement against interest, right? Isn't that what it is? So he talks about how this happened. And the defense attorney is just livid. She is deflated and she is livid because she can see that she just lost her case. The prosecutor, meanwhile, is like triumphant. She's so excited. Finally, the judge is like, this is crazy. Let's stop. And she sent everyone away. She said, figure out how to do restorative justice. I don't care how you do it, but do that. But what happened in that courtroom at that moment was that it was a battle between lawyers, right, in the theater of court. And the lawyers were disappointed. But what should have happened was that this kid should have apologized because this victim was ready to forgive him. And that's the question. Like, why would the lawyers be agitated when it is good for a kid to take responsibility for what he had done, and it's good for a victim to move on in a positive way? But the lawyers here wouldn't let that happen. They had to win, and somebody had to lose. It's like a zero-sum game, because everybody operates from a point of mistrust in the criminal justice system. Eventually, that case went to restorative justice, and the co-facilitator got sick, so I got to sit in and be there on this case. And that same kid who was in court, at one point after like a 2 or 3 hour conversation, which went really, really well, that kid said to the man who is the victim, he said, I know I'm just a kid, but I think that like I would want to be friends with you one day because I've learned a lot from you. And so I just want you to know you're like a really cool person. And the facilitator looks at the kid and says, well, what have you learned from him? And he said, I've learned that you can forgive anything. And that wouldn't have happened. One of the things I think about restorative justice is the difference between shame and guilt, which is what somebody showed me a video about by Brene Brown before I knew she was like a celebrity. But what Brene Brown says is that shame says I'm a bad person, and guilt says I did a bad thing. She says that shame is highly correlated with addiction, depression, self-harm, and violence, but that guilt is different. Guilt is inversely correlated with those things, because within guilt there is built in a path to redemption. Because you're not the bad thing yourself. You've done a bad thing. But you can make it right, and you can be better. The ability to hold something we've done or failed to do up against who we want to be, says Brene Brown, is incredibly adaptive and productive. It's difficult. It's hard to face somebody when you've hurt them or made a mistake, but it's productive. It's how we learn from our mistakes, and that's the point of restorative justice, I believe. We had a case that I think elucidates this point about shame. It was a situation where a boy tried to rob a woman, and he had a gun, and she resisted in a panic, and he ended up shooting the gun, and her body was grazed by the bullet. And they offered restorative justice, so our restorative justice facilitator went out to meet with the victim. Actually, she first met with the kid, and he was like immediately remorseful. Like, that wasn't supposed to happen, I'm so sorry, I hope the lady's okay, that kind of thing. And then the facilitator went and talked to the victim, and the victim was like totally traumatized, super scared. But after thinking about it, she said she was open to doing restorative justice. And so the facilitator is working with this victim for a while, several weeks. But even though she's meeting with her a lot, the victim is not able to talk about the incident at all. And usually our facilitators don't tell the other side what the other side is saying. But in this case, she thought that that was important. So she went back to the young person and she asked him for permission to say some of the things that he was saying to the woman. And he was like, yeah, fine. And so she went to the victim and she told him that the youth said that he wanted her to know that he was sorry and that he hopes that she is okay. And when our facilitator told the woman that, the woman just started like bawling. She just broke down, sobbing and in tears. And that was the first point she was able to start talking about what happened that day. Now, in this case, it was very unusual because virtually none of our cases go to sentencing or disposition. But because of various circumstances, in this case, they did go to sentencing before they had the Restorative Justice Conference. And this was during the pandemic, so everything is virtual. So everyone is on this like video conference with the judge. And it's the judge, the defense attorney, the prosecutor, the kid, his mom, the victim, the Restorative Justice Facilitator. And in the course of these kind of sentencing hearings, the judge kind of looks over to the victim at some point and says, now is the time for you to read your victim impact statement. Can you please read it? And the victim apparently had done a victim impact statement at the very beginning of the case when it had first come in with the prosecutor, and so she pulled it out and she read it. And I wasn't there, but our facilitator was, and she said that it was like a really long and pretty harsh victim impact statement. But at the end of it, she said, you should be ashamed of yourself. Your mother should be ashamed of you. and your father, if you even have a father, should be ashamed of you." And then the judge turned to the boy and said, "Do you have anything you want to say?" And he said, "No." And then after the hearing, our facilitator called the kid on the phone, and he said, "I don't want to do it anymore. I'm not going to meet with the lady. I don't want to do restorative justice." And so the restorative justice facilitator called his mom, and his mom said that when he left the video conferencing room because he was detained in the juvenile facility, they didn't take him to his regular unit afterwards like they were supposed to. They had to take him to another unit, which was the unit where they put kids who are on suicide watch. And this restorative justice conference never happened. And I tell this story because I think the things we think are even innocuous in our court process, in our judicial system, things like a victim impact statement, they can cause harm and shame without the dialogue of accountability and understanding, without the opportunity for redemption that we have with restorative justice. And it's just another example of how shame and mistrust and dehumanization, they're part of our court system. They are features, not bugs, of our system. And with restorative justice, what we're trying to do is we're trying to build a system of justice that's actually focused on trust and humanity and on connection. And it may seem soft or sweet or weak to do that, but it's actually an act of radical defiance. It's an aggressive effort that we are making. We are confronting great evil because we're confronting a justice system with its roots firmly planted in slavery and oppression and racism and dehumanization. And the goal of our work is to wedge ourselves into this system, into this machinery of oppression, and to prevent its brutality. And what we seek with our work in restorative justice is we seek a total transformation of this system. And currently in our office, the Office of the Attorney General in DC, we have more restorative justice facilitators on staff than we have prosecutors of juvenile crime. And so we are making a change. But in order to bring about this change, in order to bring about justice, what we may have to give up on is winning. I have a quote that's scribbled on a Post-it note on my wall in my office, and it says, "The challenges of the future will not yield to the solutions of the past." And we have to build failure into our calculus. We tried fighting the system. We tried fighting the system as public defenders. I worked in philanthropy and I funded activists and others to throw bombs at the police and at prosecutors and at the system, and it didn't work. Nothing has changed. But in my office, things have changed. Our prosecutors have changed. We had a case last year, just this past fall, that involved a really dangerous shooting in broad daylight that left a person paralyzed for the rest of his life. And afterwards, there were threats of retaliation towards the family of this victim in their neighborhood. And these family members were central to the case of the government, of the prosecution. And just like in the neighborhood, the lawyers on both sides were prepared to go to war. They were preparing for trial, which would have caused further destructions to both sides, to the victim's family, to the victim, to the accused, for everyone. And the stakes felt so high for those people, but also for our lawyers, for the prosecutors, for the defense attorneys. But the defense attorney and the prosecutor, they laid down their arms. They gave it all up. This defense attorney, who is a zealous defense attorney, told our restorative justice facilitator on the phone in confidence, "My client tells me he didn't do this, but I think he did. And I think that if you speak to him on your own, without me there, he might tell you, and then he might be willing to do this restorative justice conference." And the prosecutor, not knowing this, who was on the verge of trial, she knew what was right for the people in this case and for the victims and the witnesses, for this family and this neighborhood. And so she swallowed her pride. And she gave in to what her opponent, this defense attorney, very unreasonably asked for, which was a plea to simple assault on an attempted murder. For both sides, There was no guarantee of success in this situation, and there was no standard win at the end of this situation either. They both did what they knew were right nonetheless, and they took the criminal justice system off the table. And in so doing, there was reconciliation. The young man met with the family who he knew in this restorative justice conference, and all of the parties cried, is my understanding, throughout this conference for like 2.5 hours, and the situation was resolved as best as it was going to be resolved, and the war was over. It ended. There's this quote by a Sufi poet from the 13th century, Rumi, and it says, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there." And that's what happened here. And just a few weeks ago, the same thing happened again. In this case, the crime was an assault, but it was a particularly cruel and somewhat humiliating offense. And it resulted in deep trauma and injury to these victims. And the young man who was responsible had a history of dangerous behavior, and the case was assigned to our best trial prosecutor, and she said she could win this trial with her eyes closed, and she was probably right. The defense attorney had not been able to convince her client to take the plea, because they both knew that probably there was a chance that the intimidation of these witnesses alone would make it so that they wouldn't come to court, and so they might win at trial. And yet somehow it became clear to both sides, to both defense attorney, prosecutor, and everyone involved, that trial was not the right thing to do. The restorative justice facilitator had been working with the victims for some time and had made a lot of inroads. One of these victims was so traumatized that every time they talk about the crime, she would have a panic attack. But what she and the other victim knew is that what they needed in order to heal, what they needed for safety, was a chance to talk to this person. And the lawyers knew that too. And so they did. And on the prosecutor's side, she took virtually all the serious charges off the table. The defense attorney encouraged her client to sit down with the restorative justice facilitator and be honest with her. And he did. And he sat down, and when the facilitator talked to him about the case and talked to him about the victims and what they had gone through, he decided that he needed to do the right thing too. And she's been talking to him now for several weeks. And he knows that he needs to apologize, even though it's really hard. In fact, he's been talking to her about changing his life around, and he's made all of these steps to do so already. And this meeting will probably take place like next week or the week after, probably by the end of the month. And all of the families will be there, and the families have a lot of history intertwined, and everyone is confident that this is going to be an incredibly powerful and healing restorative justice conference. And these are just a couple of cases about what we see, but I think what they show is that we can get closer to what justice should be about accountability and empathy and healing and about behavior change. But it also shows what we lose when we pick sides and we prepare for battle at all costs. I was that public defender who had gone to trial to call the bluff of the prosecutor, to win, to get the best plea offer. I would have made the same calculus as that attorney on the Metro case, and maybe I would have won. And every so often, even today, I find myself slipping back into being adversarial, being that defense attorney, and fighting just to prove that I'm right. Somebody has made me mad. I want to show them. And sometimes I convince myself it's about, my program or my facilitators or restorative justice or something, but really it's about me. It's about me wanting to win. And when that has happened recently, I look back and I see that I've caused way more damage than what I've won. Because sometimes the danger of winning, the problem with triumph over your opponent, is that it engenders more bitterness and entrenchment and revenge. We become court Malik. We become more angry and toxic, ready to risk it all. We who fight in this system and against this system become as toxic as the system is itself, and there is no transformation there. And so the question that I have for you all that I've heard from somebody else is, how do you organize a sustained and successful challenge to structural injustice that doesn't engulf us in perpetual midnight of bitterness, a way to move forward towards reconciliation. How do you do this? By not humiliating and destroying your opponent. How, in fact, can you transform your opponent? The neuroscientists said that our neural pathways can regenerate long into adulthood. And I've heard a poet say, "I believe in the mercurial changeability of our souls, and I'm counting on it to save us again and again." And I believe in that too. I believe people can change. Not only criminal offenders and victims of carjackings, I believe that about all of us. I believe that about our political opponents. I believe that about my adversaries. And most importantly, I know that to be true about myself. Maybe not all at once, maybe not all together can I change, but I know that it is possible. I believe Court Malik can change. I believe Malik can change. And Darren and prosecutors and defense attorneys. I believe that the entire system of justice can change, but we can't do it if we only seek to win our argument, to cancel or humiliate our opponent. That will only further entrench the evil that we're fighting against. And so back to Rumi. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. I think there's time for some questions. Carla and I think Omar are in the back with microphones. Carla and Kate have microphones.
Thank you so much
Sure.
for that. So I've been a criminal defense lawyer for 50 years. You know, I often see just extreme anger on the side of the victim. And I'm wondering how it is you manage to get the folks together in the first place. So, how do you break through that? And in the case that you started out with Malik, if I'm remembering correctly, Malik and his victim, I use the term advisedly, sat down together within days of the incident, and the relatives did as well, and it's just astounding to me that the victims and the victim's family were able to do that in such a short period of time. I mean, there must be resistance at the start, and how do you overcome that?
It's a great question. The question is, how do you overcome great anger and resistance from victims and convince them to participate in restorative justice? Not all victims agree. We have some victims who are angry and justified in that anger. Some victims who really want and believe that punishment is going to be the thing that will give them the most satisfaction, and we respect that. The way we do restorative justice in our office is that it's very victim-centered. And so we defer to the victim about if they're going to be interested in sitting down with the person who committed the crime and their family. But way more victims than we would ever believe ultimately decide to do restorative justice. And the case of Malik and Darren at the school, that happened relatively quickly because I think the school had organized it and they are able to do these things very quickly. The court system moves a lot slower, of course, so we typically don't have a chance to even speak to the kid who's charged with the crime because they're represented by counsel and we've got to get permission and they first have to get a plea offer and they have to know that restorative justice is part of a plea offer, so that takes weeks and weeks. And what happens is in the interim, it gives us time to spend time with the victim of the crime. And when we first speak to the victim of the crime, oftentimes our facilitators don't even mention restorative justice. They go and meet with the victim to see how they're doing and to hear about their pain and to understand what they need and to walk with them a little. And it turns out that our justice system does a terrible job of that too. And so it's very unusual and surprising for somebody who's been hurt to have somebody come to their home and sit with them and let them vent to them and talk about how horrible this was. And our facilitators do a really good job of trying to understand how they feel, but also what they need to feel better. And in so doing, they can start to pick apart what it is they're motivated by and for, and then address that using some of the concepts of restorative justice. So some people really want this person to know how badly they've hurt them. Some people really want to know what happened. You have prosecutors who tell you all the time that they have victims who are just baffled about, why did this happen to me? What did I do? I don't understand. They have all these questions, which is actually a trauma response, I've learned, that our brains need answers when something very unpredictable has happened in order to be able to look at the world and expect that it won't happen to them again. Even if the answers to those questions are unreasonable, they need answers, and they don't get that from the justice system. Some people really want to punish the kid, but then there is a further question about, like, what does that do? Like, what does accountability look like? Like, what do you get for punishment? What do you really want? And that they will sometimes get to the place where they want this kid to learn a lesson. They want him to hear how badly they were hurt. You know, they want to say to them, how dare you? And those are all things that they can do in a restorative justice conference that they can't do in our justice system. And so through that process of speaking with and walking with a victim of crime, our facilitators are able to sometimes get them to actually agree that they want to do restorative justice. We have a few cases recently where the victim spends, time with our facilitator. Maybe like they've met a couple of times, they've had a couple of phone conversations, and they're like, no, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this. And the facilitator's like, okay, it's fine, it's your choice. You make the decision. And then they call back a couple of days later, and they're like, you know what, I want to do that thing that you were talking about. And I think it's because sometimes time helps you think more clearly. And so the fact that we have time might help. I'm not sure.
So you spoke about some of the, different outcomes for different severity of crime. I was curious if there were, statistically significant differences in types of crime. Specifically, I'm thinking of gender-based crimes or racially motivated crimes. If there are if there's any information on that, or if you've seen anecdotally any differences there.
It's a great question. If there's any statistical difference in outcomes given types of crimes, particularly gender-based crimes or hate bias-related crimes. It turns out, we tried to do this with our data, we don't have enough volume of completed cases yet to be able to have a good sense of if there are differences by charge type. But what it looks like from us is that it's not charge differentiated. And so we haven't seen, in our data at least, a difference. Like I said, in the large study that has come out recently out of the UK and Australia, they did see an improved recidivism rate when you were doing serious violent crime. And I believe that that's because part of this is about building empathy, right? And you build empathy when somebody has really been harmed. And it's palpable when we do it. You can see it, when you talk to the people beforehand, and folks are typically focused on themselves, but then when they hear somebody talk about how badly they were hurt and how much this screwed up their lives, you hear somebody talk about how now their kid, throws a tantrum every time they try and leave the house because the kid is worried about what's going to happen to their parent. All of these ripple effects of crime. It's really hurtful to the person who did it. They feel it and you can see it and they're like, oh my God, I'm so sorry about that. There are some studies that show that there's greater recidivism reductions when girls do restorative justice compared to boys. On the other hand, girls don't commit serious violent crime. When we moved from taking low-level crime to serious crime, our gender diversity for defendants changed dramatically. Now we have virtually no girls. But interestingly, I get questions about using restorative justice for hate crimes all the time. People call me about RJ for hate crimes and want me to, and I'm like, I don't really do that, but they are really interested in that. And I think that there might be something to that, and that is that when there is a crime that is based on a bias, building that empathy and understanding and seeing the other side as human is of critical importance. It is the centrally important thing. And I think there's an understanding of that. And so we have had some cases which weren't kind of coded as hate crimes in our office, because that's not how we code things, but a case where a bunch of kids spit on and then assaulted a trans woman on the train. And we had a restorative justice conference for that case. And it was really powerful for that woman to talk about how hard her life is and how it felt to have to talk about her identity to her family and to her coworkers, and how this is a part of her life every day and how targeted she feels. And this kid was really moved by that. So I think that there is the potential for that being incredibly effective, specifically for crimes of bias.
I think we have time for one more question, if there is one.
Is there a difference between the success of the conferences based on who shows up, if there's family present, if friends are present, if they're alone?
The question is if there is a difference about success of conferences depending on who attends. I've never thought of that. Because we deal with primarily juvenile crime, we always require that there be a guardian or a parent there for the young person who committed the crime. And so in every one of those cases, we have family members. And we've taken a few adult cases, and in those cases, sometimes the person's like, I don't want anybody there, even though we really encourage them to have somebody there. It doesn't seem like there's much of a difference in terms of outcome, but we have such small numbers of adult cases. The reason that it's really important for people to have supporters, in particular the person who committed the crime, is because this experience that they've gone through and the things that they promise to do, many of the things they promise to do are for the victim, right? Because that's a victim's request. But a lot of them are promises to themselves and ways that they are going to be a better person. And it seems to me that it's really important that somebody in their lives who's going to continue to be in their lives witnesses that, can hold them to that, can be there to hold that up to them when they falter in the future. And so I do think it's really important that people have supporters there, in particular people who've committed crime and supporters who are going to be a part of their lives in the future.
All right, if questions have occurred to you, Ms. Gajwani has just a few minutes before she needs to get to her next engagement, so feel free to come on up. But meanwhile, thank you. That was just enthralling.